Got it. Thank you, Scott. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And just to follow up with some of the housekeeping issues. Professor Lapsansky will stop twice. There will be two breaks in her talk when she will answer some questions. She very much wanted this to be a dialogue, a conversation. So there'll be two breaks where two questions will be answered. And then there'll be then after her talk, I'm going to say a few words about our capital preservation campaign, and then we will have a follow-up question and answer period with her as well. So stay with us, and we look forward to moving ahead with this. I can't believe there's over 115 people joining us this afternoon. So I think it's also a testimony to Professor Lapsansky and her appeal and her background and incredible knowledge of Quaker history. So we are thrilled to have her with us today. Emma Jones Lapsansky is Emeritus Professor of History and Curator of the Quaker Collection at Haverford College, where she continues to teach Quaker history and first-year writing. She received her BA in history and her doctorate in American civilization from the University of Pennsylvania. Her research interests include Quaker history and African American history, and especially the intersection between the two. Some of her recent publications include Quaker Aesthetics, which I have a copy, Back to Africa, Benjamin Coates and the American Colonization Movement, and Struggle for Freedom. Professor Lapsansky has a long list of contributed essays, including the Oxford Handbook of Quaker Studies and Quakers and Abolition. She frequently consults to museums and to curriculum developers on enriching public history and classroom history presentations. She has been an invited lecturer at Earlham College, Guilford College, George Fox College, the University of Pennsylvania, and Villanova University. She is currently at work on two projects, a history of a Bryn Mawr Quaker family and a study of mid-20th century Philadelphia multicultural intentional community. We are honored to have Professor I always stumble over her name, Lapsansky, with us, and her vast wealth of knowledge and her insights into our past and how it reflects on our present condition. Welcome.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. I spent the time while you were talking writing welcome notes to some of the people I haven't seen in a long time, and I'm looking forward to seeing them, and they're in this audience. So those of you whom I know and I haven't gotten to type in a welcome, hello, it's nice to see you. I'm going to try to pack a whole lot into a short time so we have time to talk. I like to start often with the notion that Robert Frost uses. This land was ours before we were the land's. It was one of my mother's favorite poems. She raised us on his words and on the words of Langston Hughes and County Cullen and James Weldon Johnson and William Shakespeare and Zora Neale Hurston and dozens of others. And she taught us to love words. And so today I'm going to pack your next few minutes with words, but then you signed on for this. How am I doing, Scott? Can you hear me? And can everyone else hear me? Okay. I'm just delighted to have been invited here this afternoon to chat with all of you who apparently share some of my favorite human phenomenon: Quakers, architecture, community design and aspiration, the ebb and flow of human endeavor over time. Thanks to all of you in this virtual audience for being willing to join us on what I think of as a hopscotch view of the region which this meeting house, the oldest continuously operating religious building in Pennsylvania, is one of the anchors. Frost's comments about the land being ours is about patriotism, and so today are my comments. I hope you'll find them stimulating. The photograph on the cover, and now I'm going to start this business of playing with the toys. So please hang on while I screen share. There we go. If we're lucky, this works. View slideshow. Okay. You should have on your screen the title of this talk.
We do.
Okay, good. This photograph is on the cover of a study that profiles a number of early meeting houses, embodied by Silent Witness, which uses architecture to explore a relationship between individual people, the communities we envision and endeavor to build, and the land we choose to occupy as we try to live out our visions. Or maybe the land chooses us. Exploring this relationship between people, architecture, and community, and what has become known as the history through material culture, is the underpinning of all the research and writing I have done over the last half century. Over that half century of being a historian, I was blessed with a mother who in 1974, when I was finishing a dissertation about a Philadelphia neighborhood, spent days and days in a research library, combing through city directories, that is the 18th century equivalent of phone books, which we don't have anymore, making note cards for me of every African-American family along South Street and their occupation. My mother's been gone for more than 2 decades, but I'm sure she's someplace wonderful. She certainly earned it. I wish such a relationship for all of us who wonder how people did life before us and how we might learn what we want for our planet's future. I hope what we do here today helps feed your enthusiasm for exploring what you can learn from your ancestors about how we all make a more compassionate, inclusive, team-spirited, and less violent world for ourselves and for our heirs. But I digress. Let's return to Lower Merion and its developers over time, many of whom did their best work toward that aspirational world. In the early 1980s, the Lower Merion Historical Society, that wonderful institution right around the corner from you, it's not around the corner from Seattle, but close enough, published a wonderful series of studies of Montgomery County, the second 100 years. There is a 90-page section that includes Phyllis Mayer's view of Marion. And she describes Lower Merion as a place that was designated in 1713 and occupies slightly more than 23 square miles of Montgomery County's 487 square miles. Once connected to Narberth and Conshohocken, Lower Merion became an independent borough in 1874. This Meyer person is of particular interest to me because one of my last acts before leaving Haverford, leaving the curatorship in 2005, was to go to the Meyer family at Harriton and collect all their wonderful papers and bring them to Haverford. They are absolutely a treasure trove of beautiful things that tell us how people were struggling to make life matter in the late 17th, 18th, and 19th century. At the end of this talk, I have a page which I'm not quite sure how the technotypes, Ross and Steve will get, and Scott will get them to you. I have a bibliography, a suggestion of things you might want to read as you go farther. And one of the things in that bibliography, and it's all online. I just look stupid. I didn't decide to give you anything to read that you couldn't get to. So everything I've suggested is available online and you can go there and play with the toys. One of the toys is a listing of the various people and families who lived at Harriton over the years, and their papers are now at Haverford and being processed. There are dozens of them, thousands of them, wonderful things. This Meyer is a descendant of the family that last owned and occupied the Harriton estate. All right, let me see how I make my, it doesn't want to let me.
Try clicking on the slide. Yep, there you go.
Okay, there we go. Thank you very much, whoever that was. She wrote about how the first settlers of the Welsh tract arrived in 1682. That's not the one I want. There's the one I want. Okay. Apparently they arrived in August of 1682 aboard the ship Lion, which was 2 months before William Penn arrived. And they named their first settlement Marion, as many had come from the Marian Friends Meeting House. It was constructed in 1695, and it's the oldest place of worship in continuous use in Pennsylvania. Many of you probably know that. Now you can think about it slightly differently. It shares its longevity with Third Haven Meeting. There we are. Not very big, but it is what it is. Third Haven Meeting, which is in Maryland, and it's in Eastern Maryland. Following the Welsh settlers came English, German, Irish, Italian Americans, and lots more over the next couple of centuries. The first German Lutheran school, erected in 1787, still stands. The site of the Lower Marion Baptist Church was donated to the congregation by Charles Thompson, who was a secretary to the Continental Congress and who was an owner of Harriton Mansion. Lower Marion now has 47 religious institutions of various faiths actively serving the community. So says Phyllis Meyer in 1980. Maybe there are more now. She then goes on to describe the place as a place. Soil in most of the township consists of a dark surface layer about 8 inches deep with a yellowish brown subsoil ranging from 2 to 8 feet in depth. The soils are mainly acid with variable permeability. Obviously, this woman has made friends with the neighborhood, has made friends with the place. And part of what I talk to, think about, try to commune with is the feeling of place. And we're going to talk more about that. She says that most early farms contained 1 or more springs, many of which are now piped underground. A county inventory lists 78 historical cultural sites. Lancaster Pike, completed in 1796 from Philadelphia to Lancaster, and the first road to be macadamized, passed through Lower Marion for 4.5 miles. Although Lower Marion was an independent township in 1713, it didn't become a separate voting district until March 31st, 1806. She goes on to talk about population, and I recommend this 96-page study. It's in the bibliography I'm sending you, because it just gives a sense of a person's connection to place. The 1980 census says that the total number of inhabitants is 59,000, 56,000 of which are white, 3,500 of which are non-white. The median age is 38.1. Those numbers have changed since then, surely. Okay. I'm going to give you a little more grounding and then I'm going to move on. In 1880, Ardmore had only mud roads with an occasional oil lamp lighting on the wooden sidewalks. The telegraph office had opened in 1850, and by 1885, the first telephone switchboard was installed at Stettleman's Pharmacy in Ardmore. 200 customers had telephones by 1904. The gas company was organized in February 1886, and she's right down on the ground, and I encourage you to be so too. And now that we have kind of envisioned that ground, what I want to do is take you into the head of people who lived in the neighborhood. In 1860, shortly before she died at age 20, Jane Gibbons Rhodes wrote to her brother, "How can I be grateful enough for my Heavenly Father, whose love has enabled me to look forward to an early, perhaps a sudden death, with hope, without, as it regards myself, a single regret." Her self-reflective composure and optimism was not uncommon among a network of young middle-class and upper-class Quaker women whose journals and correspondence record their spiritual lives and their daily experiences. Raised in Quaker meetings and Friends schools, these women had been nourished by the writings of 17th and 18th century Friends. Such writings, and the example of their own parents, led Jane Rhodes and her peers to set her life goals: piety, integrity, self-discipline, frugality, and gratitude to the Heavenly Father. Loyalty and service to family and Quaker community were equally important, as was philanthropic engagement with the wider world. And copious, meticulous, God, you gotta love them, meticulous record keeping. We know more about us than we probably should. There's correspondence, there's self-interrogation, there's introspection. The next person I'm going to introduce you to, and I'm not going to tell you who it is quite yet, kept a diary, and I have been massaging that diary for the last 10 years. The diary will keep me busy till I die, and I'm not planning to die anytime soon. Got too much to do. But in any case, lots of record keeping. Modeled on the teachings of their 18th century Quaker forebears, such was the prescribed regimen for 19th century American Quakers. Indeed, much of the enduring Quaker identity was forged on the anvil of that 18th century experimentation, culture, and practice. Set against the backdrop of an emerging Atlantic world capitalism, and I want to stress that a big piece of this was that while much of the imagery is of simple Quakers who are proud to be simple, et cetera, I think we miss the point if we forget that Quakers were deeply involved in the invention of modern day Quakerism, of capitalism, deeply involved in the shipping industry, deeply involved in the birth of the banking industry in England, deeply involved in the development of railroads in England and in the US. I think we don't really understand our neighborhood without really understanding that indeed there's a Quaker bedrock under all of the capitalist building of the US in particular, in general, and of Marion and Wynwood and Bryn Mawr in particular. Much of it was formed on a complex mix of economic, philosophical, theological, social, technological, and literary realities that ushered in the modern world. The Religious Society of Friends and Truth, emerging from 17th century England's chaotic religious discord, had developed a surprisingly rigid regimen for achieving that state of being grateful enough to my Heavenly Father to anticipate death with hope. This regimen, crystallized through the long 18th century, was based in a culture of individual spiritual responsibility, set in a commitment to holy conversation. A holy conversation included an understanding and reverence for Quaker practices, familiarity with the lives and writings of founding friends, and an abstemious consumption style that downplays the intrinsic value of objects, even while Quakers have been and continue to be, and this meeting house is one example of it, really quite reverential about the objects that go with Quaker life. The Rhodes family, and I've just read you a little piece of that diary from that young woman, shared a meeting house and family intermarriages with the Norris, McClenahan, Vaux, Shin, and Wood families, all of which lived in that Marion neighborhood. And they are among a few hundred Friends families who in the 18th century planted and sustained the foundations of Quaker networks worldwide. Building upon the 17th century foundations of the shared authority monthly, quarterly, yearly meeting organizational structure, William Penn had shaped an intertwined political, economic, familial, and religious system for his experiment in Philadelphia. Jane Gibbons Rhodes was a prime example of the 19th century Quaker who had absorbed the essence of 18th century Quaker culture. So too was Naomi McClenahan Morris. You drive by Montgomery Avenue and you probably wonder as you're driving up there, who are these McClenahan people? Some of you probably already know. The rest of you are wondering who they were. They're fascinating people. Naomi McClenahan Morris, whose diary I've been reading, in 1881, as a 70-year-old matriarch of Harriton, near Bryn Mawr, meticulously monitored her activities, her expenditures, and her service to the Quaker and to the wider community. She modernized her farmhouse with a new cook stove in 1881. Okay, so she's a modernist, even while she's a simple Quaker. She modernized her farmhouse with a new cook stove and a new fangled appliance to heat water in the bathroom. She also did something which a student of mine looked at, scratched his head, and I don't quite know, I couldn't help him with it. She put in a burglar alarm in 1881. Okay. She modernized her farmhouse with a cook stove, an appliance to heat water in the bathroom, and she entertained countless family members. One family, for example, arrived with 3 children, a nurse, 4 horses to spend the summer. This is serious house guesting. While dutifully overseeing numerous family deaths, she also managed the farm production and provisioning, agricultural schedules, mosquitoes, and harvesting. She saw to her extended family's medical needs, including asthma, tumors, rheumatism, measles, and she documented weather, housework schedules, intra-family visits, and family celebrations. Naomi had, through a quite complex system of families and wills, inherited Harrington when she was 6 weeks old. Though she'd been widowed for nearly 15 years by 1881, her journal indicates that she had been for many decades the primary administrator of her family's widespread land holdings. Her extensive library, wonderful library, by the way, and they're all cataloged at Haverford. Her extensive library, with dated margin notes in many of the volumes, attests to her knowledge of and reflection upon a wide array of Quakers authors dating back to the 17th century. Naomi's life extended beyond the boundaries of her farm. In July 1881, quite a large gathering of Quakers from several yearly meetings assembled at nearby Haverford College, which many of you know was started in 1833 to protect good Orthodox Quakers from those terrible infidels, the Hicksites. But several yearly meetings, representatives assembled at Haverford College to strategize about higher education for women. Radical, radical, radical. In support of that conference, Naomi's household hosted distant relative James Wood, an alumnus of Haverford and a descendant of longstanding New York Quakers, who had traveled 150 miles from Mount Kisco, New York, to attend deliberations that would lead to the creation of Bryn Mawr College, for which the Vaux family, also part of Naomi's extended family, would contribute a parcel of land. Naomi also cast her eye beyond the Quaker world. In September, she recorded with concern and dismay the assassination of James Garfield and her anxiety about a national community that bred such violence. I must say that I'm in the same place, but that's a parenthesis. Naomi's full life was embedded in a team effort that included her son-in-law, James T. Shin, who in conjunction with her cousin, George Vaux, resided on the adjoining estate, and they all helped manage the farm's finances. These men, too, had been steeped in Quaker faith and community life, even as Quakers' numbers diminished during the 19th century. But this same devout Quaker woman decided late in her life that she could not have a portion of her land ownings be named Codorus Farm. Now, what was Codorus Farm, you're now asking? The answer to that question takes us backward in time to the establishment of the Harrington Plantation, yes, plantation, in the 18th century, for Harrington may have been the northernmost slave plantation in America. The history of the Harrington estate begins with Roland Ellis, who was born in Wales. He visited Pennsylvania in 1686 and moved here in 1696. He settled on about 698 acres in the Welsh tract. He named his property Bryn Mawr, after his estate in Wales, which passed to his daughter Anna Ellis. Ellis is said to have built the mansion house, which still stands today as a museum, in 1704. Richard Harrison was a Maryland tobacco farmer, a slaveholder, and a Quaker. He married Hannah Norris and bought Bryn Mawr in 1719. Harrison moved his family there from Herring Creek, Maryland, bringing with him his slaves. He renamed the state Harrington, following the example of his father-in-law, Isaac Norris. Richard Harrison kept his slaves there, and it became one of the largest northern slave plantations of its time. But he was at one point chastised by his meeting for keeping slaves. So he built a separate meeting house and a family burial ground at Harrington so that he could withdraw from the Quakers who said, don't keep slaves, and keep his slaveholding enterprise. Hannah Morrison Thompson was the daughter of Richard Harrison and Hannah Norris Harrison, a Quaker minister whose parents had been prominent, and the daughter of a colonial official. Hannah Harrison married the Secretary of Continental Congress, Charles Thompson, and inherited the Harrington estate from her father upon his death. You don't have to remember this family history. It's in an article that is in your bibliography, which you'll get at the end. Hannah Harrison Thompson lived with her husband at 4th and Spruce, but after his retirement, they returned to her childhood home in Wynwood. Charles Thompson was an abolitionist, and presumably it was he who ended the practice of keeping slaves at Harriton. But the Thompsons had no children, and after helping to raise her great-nephew, Charles McClanahan, the eldest surviving child of his generation, they selected Charles to inherit the Harriton estate after their deaths. However, Hannah Morrison died in 1807 and Charles died shortly thereafter. Charles McClanahan then left the inheritance to his 6-week-old daughter, Naomi McClanahan, whose diary I have been devouring. But under the terms of a life estate, Charles Thompson remained in the old Harriton mansion until his death in 1824. Paige Cadoris, now we're back to the Cadoris story, was a former servant or slave, probably a servant. May have been African-American, may have been mixed race. He was a favorite of Charles Thompson and was probably raised inside the Thompson household. During his lifetime, Charles Thompson gave Cadoris a life estate in a part of the Harriton property. The land was known as Cadoris Farm, and it was legally owned by Paige Cadoris, but he never lived there. Instead, he moved downtown into a Black community along South Street, which is where I encountered him at another time in his life, or my mother did. And he leased the land in Bryn Mawr to tenant farmers. Okay. Cadoris died in 1840, and his piece of the Cadoris farm then reverted back to Naomi McClanahan, who had inherited the property from her father. She had moved there with her husband, Levi Morris. In the late 19th century, after her husband had died, Naomi decided it was improper for a Quaker lady to live in a house named after a slave, although Paige Cadoris may not have been a slave. But anyway, she decides that she really can't be living in a house named for somebody Black, so she renames the area Harriton. There may be some of the Cadoris family buried in the graveyard, and I may have. Let me see if I have I don't. Okay, let's go back. Somewhere I have a photograph of the Harriton Cemetery, and the stones, many of them are unmarked. It's hard to find. But anyway, you'll be able to look through that in your material too. Okay. Fast forward 5 years from Naomi McClanahan's diary, the part of it that I read you from 1881. And we get to Bryn Mawr College. 5 years before Bryn Mawr College opened its doors in 1885 to a young woman seeking a kind of rigorous academic training that was then unavailable at any other elite institution. Only 15 Black people resided in Lower Merion Township. Most were young, single men from Pennsylvania and its neighboring states. The youngest among them, a 9-year-old servant named George Taylor, was from New Jersey. There was only one Black family among the residents of Lower Merion Township in 1880, a married couple with 5 children named Mr. and Mrs. Penrose Hall. And so I'm suggesting to you that as early as the 1820s with Paige Cadoris and into the 1880s with Naomi McClanahan Morris, there is down the street a lone Black family, Mr. and Mrs. Penrose Hall. Mr. Hall had served in the military during the Civil War, probably listed in the US colored troops. And I know from looking at the list that the expert on the US colored troops, is sitting among you in this audience. Now, you can't see her because of the crazy way that Zoom is put together, but I know she's here, and I'm going to tell you about her in a few minutes. She is a wonderful local historian with many interesting stories to tell. And she's probably blushing now because she knows who she is. Hall, Penrose Hall, was a Civil War veteran and later became a carrier for the US Postal Service, while his wife stayed home to raise their 2 daughters and 3 sons, right on the doorstep of Naomi McClenaghan Morris. Neighbors probably listened for the familiar clip-clop of horses' hooves. I'm now quoting from an article. I'm going to tell you where I got it from in a minute. Neighbors probably listened from the clip-clop of horses' hooves as Mr. Hall made his daily rounds, hoping he might stop his carriage in front of their house to deliver something to them. Whereas Mr. Hall likely worked 6 days a week, rain or shine, his horse may have worked 7 if he hitched her to his mail buggy and drove his wife and children to the First United Methodist Church of Roxborough on Sunday mornings. So there's a religious community for African Americans down the road. When Mrs. Hall buried her husband in the wide, flat field of Leverington Cemetery at Ridge and Lyceum Avenues in December 1888, perhaps her foot clasped at the thought of hearing the clip-clop of the mail carrier's horse on the road again, knowing that from then on, the driver would not be her husband. During the final years of his life, Mr. Hall may have watched the rapidly changing landscape in Lower Merion Township with surprise and wonder from atop his 4-wheeled perch. Perhaps his delivery route shifted to accommodate the newly founded Bryn Mawr College in 1885, just a short few miles up the road from his home in Manayunk. Maybe he passed the college and thought of his little Bella and Laura, their bright and curious brown eyes lighting up as he taught them to read. Because Mr. Hall was probably a lettered man, since he was certainly a man of letters. Though he was far from wealthy, Mr. Hall had done well for himself after the war. At the very least, he was better off than his brother Oliver, who worked long, back-breaking hours as a farm laborer and servant. And with that, I'm going to stop for a moment. And while I play with my machine to do a different kind of screen sharing, I want to hear from whoever's hand you, Scott, can see up there, or Ross, who has a thought. What are you thinking is what I'm going to ask you. Somebody
so there should be a, under your list of participants, there's a raise your hand. And if you want to raise your hand, if you want to ask a question, you can unmute yourself and ask the question, but we can.
I'm not even sure, completely interested in your asking a question. I want someone to raise your hand, either to ask a question or just to respond and say, gosh,
Right.
I didn't know
Okay.
that before.
Okay.
This is called a what are you thinking question. I do this in my classroom all the time, and students are caught deer in the headlights. So I'm imagining you, all 79 of you or 115 of you, deer in the headlights. Somebody in that audience, put your hand up and say what you're thinking right this minute. While I look for a picture I'm going to show you.
Yes, Laura Jackson.
Yeah.
Hi, Laura Jackson. It's nice
Hey,
to see you.
How are you?
I'm good and glad to see you.
Yeah. I'm just thrilled that there are historians in the world. And
Me too.
my general picture, and in particular, I am so grateful and appreciative of the years you've spent finding these precious details like journals and diaries so that you can put together a story bigger than any of us could ever read or know. And I'm really enjoying it. Thank you so much.
It's a story with people in it. I try to have a story with people in it, not just there were wars and trains got built and buildings went up. There are people doing this.
Yes, people doing this, doing the everyday lives, clopping along and getting new stoves and building the community. So thank you so much.
Just
Okay, I have found what I'm looking for here.
How do I raise my hand? What method do you want us to use?
There is.
If you have a comment, I know Gwen, you had. Why don't we go to Gwen, and then whoever just spoke will go and then we'll let Professor Lapsansky get started again.
Yeah, I don't have a comment. Thank you. I just wanted
Okay.
to hear the process.
The process for raising your hand is you go to participants, you click on participants, and it's on the right-hand side, there's a raise hand, it's blue.
Oh, I got it. Okay, right.
Okay, so I just want to say how astounded I am that Quakers had slaves. And this
Oh, good. I'm glad you're
not the
astounded.
first
I was
time.
talking about, yes, exactly.
Yeah, William Penn had slaves. It just, when I grew up my whole life a Quaker and never thought that this would have been anything that Quakers would have believed in. It is so opposed to everything that I was brought up.
Well, it's an interesting story, and I try to keep the story in the context of Quakers are people with and have been people with huge aspirations, but they're still people, and they're still people who live in a world with people, and they do what people do in the world. What we don't tend to remember is that many Quakers held slaves, and that Fox worried about it in 1671. He said, I don't know about this. I don't think this is such a good idea. But they were coming from a place where there were servants, and servants and indentured servants were a part of the world they knew. It's unrealistic of us to assume that Quakers living in that world would suddenly say, oh, we're not going to have slaves. We're not going to have servants. We're not going to have anybody do our work for us. We're all going to do it. It wasn't, it just, they were people. It took them from 1671 to 1688 for somebody to begin to say, as they did also in a Philadelphia area meeting, Germantown monthly meeting, and this is an aside, but if we don't finish, we don't finish. When someone said, slavery is a bad idea for a whole variety of reasons. Some of the reasons are that you can't keep people in slavery without violence or the threat of it, and therefore it must be a bad idea because we don't want to do violence. Slavery is a bad idea because it invites violence into our households. People who are angry being slaves are likely to be violent to us or to our children when we're not around. So in 1688, the first thoughts were that slavery was a bad idea because it compromised the spirit of white Quakers. It's not till more than 100 years later that people move through it, but we moved through all sorts of things. Look at how long it took us to figure out that that raping the earth was a bad idea. We're still working on that one. I don't think blame is, but I'm glad the surprise is there. That's good.
Thank you.
Hi, Gwendolyn. I haven't seen you in a long time either. It's nice to see you. Okay, going to take you back to Bryn Mawr and to a Black Bryn Mawr. Can you see a photograph here? Two laborers working on Bryn Mawr College.
Yes.
In 1903. And I want to stop that share and move to another share. I hope I can get there. And there she is. Good. Okay, we can get there. Okay. Within the last 5 years, bless their hearts, a group, oh, phooey. Okay. Within the last 5 years, a group of people at Bryn Mawr have begun, no, that's not the one I want. Where is it? Phooey. This technology is beyond me. Can you tell? I'm going to stop sharing. Going to start sharing again. Going to share.
Sometimes Alt-Tab will take you through your open windows.
Yes, I have to go back and find this window and open it. It's a photograph of a Black woman on the Bryn Mawr campus in 1903, trying to find my way back there. Well, while I'm finding my way back there, and I'm just going to be relaxed about how hard this is. While I'm finding my way back there, I'm going to tell you about what Bryn Mawr students have done in the last 5 years. They've started to do a Black story of Bryn Mawr College. We know the story of its founding and of the philanthropists who founded the college for women. There is this group of women who have been posting this stuff on a page called The View from Black Bryn Mawr. And I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to get there. It's going to be a two-step process, folks. Just bear with me. I don't want to go to that map yet. Stop sharing.
Emma, we're all with you.
Okay, good.
All right.
I'm glad you're patient.
We are.
I'm then gonna.
We're expectant.
Yeah, I hope so. I'm gonna end the show. There she is, this woman I want up on my desktop. Oh, I know where she is. Okay, I can find her. And then I can go back with you and share screen. And there she is. And I can share. And there she is. A maid on the steps of Marion Hall, 1898. And here is sort of her story. See if I can get to her story. Yes. I'm finding the pieces. Okay. During the final years of his life, Mr. Hall watched the rapidly changing landscape in Lower Merion Township with surprise and wonder. But if hope for racial equality flickered even fleetingly in Mr. Hall's mind, it was far from a reality at Bryn Mawr in 1885. If Mr. Hall did see Black people on Bryn Mawr's campus before his death in 1888, it was only in the roles of subservience to white students, staff, and faculty. By 1900, 68 Black people resided on Bryn Mawr's campus, most of them women, and all of them servants. You know, it's an interesting view of Bryn Mawr. They hailed from places near and far, from Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, and even Canada. They had names like Josephine, Lulu, Alice, Eliza, Rose, Addie, Mamie, and Nadine. Most were young, single women who came to work for the college alone. Perhaps their families had settled in Philadelphia, or perhaps they'd left their families behind. They were the forerunners of the Great Migration spurred by the World War 14 years later, securing domestic jobs that would become increasingly scarce as their Southern sisters traveled northward by train, boat, and bus, seeking work in foundries, factories, and private homes. The women on the Bryn Mawr campus worked as waitresses, cooks, chambermaids, parlor maids, bell girls, and servants. The men worked as porters and pantrymen. Their lives were a flurry of steaming pots, clattering dishes, ringing phones, and fresh white linens. They worked their bones to deep ache every step on the last stair up their cramped quarters to the fourth floor of Marion Hall, creaking beneath their tired weight. Pennsylvania labor law required the college to give servants 24 consecutive hours off per week, one full day, which Director of Halls Ellen Faulkner described in 1926 as something of an annoyance. We're always shorthanded, for we have no relief maids, nor can we consider adding them to our staff because of the additional expense and the impossibility of finding room for them in our servants' quarters. When Jessie Fawcett, the first Black student at Bryn Mawr, attended the college for a month in 1901, before President Carey Thomas raised enough money for her to transfer her to Cornell, one wonders what the maids might have thought of her presence. Did any of them get a chance to know Fawcett during the brief time she spent living in the maid's room on campus? What did they whisper to one another about her forced removal from the college when they bumped into each other in the laundry or the supply closets? What opinions did they have, if they dared to have any opinions at all? And when Fawcett rose to prominence as a Harlem Renaissance author and poet in the 1920s, did any of them turn to her writing for a voice that could speak for them? Okay, what's exciting about this is that these students at Bryn Mawr have been posting a blog since 2015 that brings out those backstories and puts them out front. We're Bryn Mawr students of today and Bryn Mawr faculty and anybody who goes to the web, and you will soon be among those people who can go to the web, because that connection is in the, I see you nodding. I don't know who you are, but I'm glad you're nodding. The person in the red sweatshirt with a fireplace and a picture behind her. But anyway, it's a wonderful story, I think. We're going to be able soon to tell the stories of all sorts of people. We're going to be able to tell the stories bit by bit of the Italians who built the railroads and the buildings, of the architects who designed the buildings, of all those people who made it all happen. And the world is bringing those people to the front. I'm looking at time and realizing that I'm about a third of the way through where I'm going to go. So I probably will stop here. I'm going to stop in a minute. In 1910, the ratio of Black workers to white faculty at Bryn Mawr was immensely disproportionate, with the number of Black employees at the college outnumbering the white ones. The ratio had come slightly less disproportionate by 1920, but only by a little bit. This group at Bryn Mawr used census records and Bryn Mawr's records to talk about all this. And they end by concluding this way. It describes colleges not just a place in which to learn, but a place from which to learn. And those records of Bryn Mawr are out there for you to see. Among the other records that are out there for you to see are the records of the US colored troops, a few of whom came from the neighborhood. And the person who knows all about the US colored troops is Joyce Mosley, who is in this audience somewhere, and whose notes are in my note to you. Some of her notes are in my note to you. I'm going to stop there and get into a conversation. We have about 5 minutes, then we're going to break so you can hear from the Marion meeting people the whole reason that this talk was envisioned. And then we'll do some questions after that. So that person who has a hand up or who put a hand up, don't wait for it to be acknowledged. Put your voice in. Speak. Whoever speaks first is the one to speak. I see a hand. I don't know your name, but I see a hand up, so speak. Okay. Unmute.
Hi.
Unmute. Okay, there you are. You have to unmute. The person I see who is speaking and wanting to speak is a woman in glasses with a red chair behind her, wearing a red flowered shirt. Your hand is up, so unmute and speak. You have to unmute yourself. You have to push that little red button on your screen in order to unmute. Hi, Will Lesser. It's nice to see you.
Hi, Emma. How are you?
I'm good. Are you the one to speak up?
Well, I had a thought. Were you reading your writing, or is that directly from the blog?
Part of it was directly from the blog. Part of it was directly from me. This blog is wonderful.
It was very, with a lot of feeling, a lot of intensity in
Exactly.
the beauty. It was powerful. I enjoyed that, like, that amount of feeling is coming through in the posting and in your talk.
Well, go to the blog. I'm going to send you a bibliography, but you can find Grace Pusey. You can find, Google will take you to Grace Pusey's blog. It's wonderful.
Okay. I'll look it up.
Hi, Emma.
Yep.
This is Bob Sutton. I was at Haverford started in 65. I married my wife, Bryn Mawr, who was my wife, Susan, who was at Bryn Mawr, and she lived in Pem East at the time. And she was very upset at the, not only did they have African-American maids, black maids waiting on them, but they also had dining hall upstairs that they shared with Pem East above Pem Archway. And they had these black women who would wait on them individually at the table. And my wife, Susan, was very upset at this. And she finally organized a situation where they eventually relieved those employees of those jobs and let them continue with their other work and set up student waitresses, as it were. The employees were living in, I think it was above either Pem West or Rockefeller, under the attic there. But it was it's sort of towards the end of this, but going up into the mid 60s. And I think they kept the employees on until they retired. So they weren't just tossed out into the street. But it was I think that Bryn Mawr students, even back then, even a largely white Bryn Mawr back then, were very aware of this and concerned about desire to move this in the context of the civil rights movement of the 60s.
Let me show you something. Yes, it's an interesting story, and it brings out everybody's story along with it. Let me show you this for a moment. See if I can figure out how to screen share this. This is taken from the.
There it is.
Can you see the Bryn Mawr students being?
Yep, that's it.
There they are.
Right. That's exactly what it was like. And I think part of the reason that this continued at Bryn Mawr is because M. Carey Thomas and her good buddy were from Baltimore, and that more than Philadelphia, and they were sort of Quakers too, but I think it reflects a sort of Baltimore attitude more than a Philadelphia attitude, but that it sort of pushed itself up into this area.
And it does reflect a class attitude.
I agree.
That is kind of everywhere, and people are who they are. I say to my students, you can't blame people for being born into privilege any more than you can blame people for not being born into privilege. It's the world they knew.
Right.
And it's a world that that in some circles treated the help well, sometimes paid their tuition, sometimes helped them buy houses, and felt that this was a way to be in the world. There's a whole lot of story to be told here. And there are various aspects of it that have a lot of people behaving well, a lot of people behaving badly. It's a complex story. Indeed, at the moment, I am working on a history of a plantation in Maryland, near Towson, Maryland, from whom the people did marry into some Pennsylvania Quakers, married into the Potts family and into various other kinds of things. And the sharing of culture and of slave use between these two different places in North versus South makes for a much richer story. And to tell half of it is to miss the story.
Right.
I
and
agree.
Let me also say to let Bryn Mawr off the hook a little bit. While I was at Haverford, we would have these, what I assume are probably Sicilian cleaning ladies who would come. This is when Haverford was a men's school and was very small. I think my class was the first expansion, and we were up to 450 when I was there. We would have these cleaning ladies that would come through and clean our rooms once a week. And they would come in and speak some sort of, gibberish, local Italian or something like that, some sort of version of Italian. We called them wombats. I don't think we called them wombats to their faces, but that's, and people did that.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I say I'm looking I'm hoping that today's talk will inspire some of you to go tell the rest of these stories so that we can knit them together. There certainly was an Italian population in Marion, and the part of my paper I'm not going to get to give talks about some numbers from the 1880s on, when various kinds of people who did an array of things to build the neighborhood came into the country. It's a high immigrant time from 1880 on, and from 1880 until 1950 or so. What you have is a widening immigrant population everywhere, including wrapped around these areas. It's just that this material is available, and this material is attached to Marion Meeting, which is why I pulled it up this time. But yes, it's a much complicated and intertwined story. I would agree. I'm going to stop there for a moment. Keep chewing on your questions. And while you are chewing, I'm going to hand the podium back to Scott, who is going to talk about how this talk came to be.
Actually, it's going to be a handoff to Ross.
Oh, okay.
That's okay.
I'm going to share a screen while you do so, if that's okay.
Okay.
You talk, I'll share screen.
Sure. Thank you so much. And what a great talk. We look forward to having everyone stay and get some more questions and answers in after this short message from your sponsor. So we're really glad to have you here. This is the kickoff to our preservation campaign to help preserve Marion Friends Meeting. Marion was founded in 1682, and we are a small but mighty group of friends who have called this site home for 338 years. So besides being our religious home, we are also the stewards of this site, and this is a responsibility that we take very seriously. We are preserving this National Historic Landmark, not only for ourselves and our community, but also for the nation. There are only roughly 2,500 National Historic Landmarks in the whole country, and this one is ours. But we can't preserve it without the help of our friends and our neighbors, and also from foundations and other grants. So founded in 1862, the meeting house the construction was begun in 1695, but not completed until 1715. We also have a caretaker's house on the site that was built by Joseph Price, a local builder, and he did a little bit of everything. He made coffins. I think Jerry Francis from the Historical Society is on this meeting. And they have Joseph Price's libraries in the Historical Society library. And I know that they detail every day, the weather every day. Anyway, Joseph Price built our caretaker's house in 1804. John Dickinson donated the property where our caretaker's house is located, and part of the property that the Marion now owns. We have two horse sheds that were built in the early 1800s. And even our most recent building, our activities building, which was built in 1950, is already considered a historic site, a historic building, due to its age. So I won't go into the long list of all the repairs and all the needs that we have, being such old buildings and old, just a whole environment that is all of these 338 years under its belt. But I'll point to one highly visible thing that happened. Our retaining wall on Montgomery Avenue collapsed about 2 years ago. And it cost $120,000 to rebuild the wall. And that's just one tiny part of what our overall needs are. So what we're doing is we're doing a two-part preservation program. The first part of the program is just the planning project. Our historic preservation architect, Dan Campbell, is on the Zoom meeting with us. And Dan has put together a group of experts who are going to come in and look at all of the buildings and the sites and the landscape, the retaining walls, and put together a plan for how to preserve everything. And then Dan will take this and put it into a prioritization list of what needs to be done immediately, what can wait a couple of years. And then we'll get a cost estimator to put a price on the whole thing. Then with that document, we will start phase 2, which is raising the money once we know how much money we need to raise for the actual preservation work. We'll raise that money through another round of fundraising, through grants, and on the rest of our capital campaign. We've already raised $25,000 from the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission for the planning grant, but we still need $50,000 more. So I will ask all of you to share this information and to help us raise this money. And just as a sort of testimony to the generosity and the affluence of our neighborhood, we put up 2 banners on Montgomery Avenue announcing the kickoff of our capital campaign, and 2 people who are neighbors, but who are not members of the meeting, sent us individually checks for $500. So there's a lot of generosity in the neighborhood and in the community, and so we want to preserve the meeting for another 338 years. So please help us. We're not ashamed to ask for help. We can't do it without you. We're a small group, but I think the meeting house is important enough to have everybody chip in a little bit, and hopefully we can get to reach our goal. So with that, I will turn it back over to Emma.
I'll just say that, just sorry to interrupt, but
yes.
MarionFriends.org.
Yes, thank you.
So the same place where you actually registered for this event, you'll see a button there to support the work that we're trying to get done.
MarionFriends.org. Thank you.
Can I just jump in and say one other thing? I'm clerk of Marion meeting, and one of the things we've done is when this epidemic, whatever it is, lifts, we have decided we will be able to lead tours through the meeting house so that you can actually see it. Some of this wainscoting in the background that you can see was supposedly brought over from Wales. We've heard from people in Wales that have the attesting of this. So they brought this over knowing that they were going to build something, and they landed it down near East Falls and carried it up here. So that's part of the whole picture. But if it's really one of the really great old buildings, one of the old, not just a Quaker meeting house, but any old building here in Eastern Pennsylvania. And it's a real pleasure. And I say this as an archaeologist who works in Greece, but it's just a masterpiece, as you can see. And we will be open for tours. You can just contact us through the website when the pandemic lifts.
Thank you, Bob. Professor, are you ready to jump back in? You're muted.
I am ready to listen to questions and
okay. Thank you very much.
And discussion. I'm happy with the I was just thinking thing.
Mm-hmm.
Mute my audio. Hi, this is Melinda Yin. I have a question. I was very curious when you shared that number about the population of African Americans living in Lower Merion in the 1880s, I think it was. And I'm just wondering the kinds of difficulty you encounter getting that kind of data, because when I've looked at records of census in Philadelphia, not in Lower Merion, but in Philadelphia, I mean, just the way that
my name, yes,
people looked at race and ethnicity is so very different than we look at it now. I mean, there were categories for Negroes or colored or Irishmen or Italian. That was just the concept of race was really very different. So can you talk a little bit about how that was accounted for then?
I myself have not been in the local census records, and I share your view that the Philadelphia records are complex. They're even complex about race, because if you had a person living on a given street in 1840, that person might be called Black, but he's still there 10 years ago and has made some money, and he's now described as mulatto. That is to say, he's moved up in class and therefore has a different racial designation. I don't know the degree. So the point I'm making is that census takers were a lot less regimented than they currently are now. And name spellings would change, lots of things changed. I don't know what the census takers in this neighborhood were like at that point. The person who did the census, the close looking at census, is Grace Pusey. That's where this comes from. And so I would encourage you to go back to that Bryn Mawr website which I will send you, and actually William Leeser has sent it to you. Go back to that website and contact her, because she's the one who's actually been on the ground. I was quoting her. Are there other thoughts and questions?
You can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay. Just to comment on the census, I've spent a lot of time in the Philadelphia census because I can track my family back to the 1600s in Philadelphia. And they were Quakers back then as well. So I think it really depended on the person that was taking the census of that particular street, because I have family members that lived on different streets and they were classified differently.
Exactly. That's the experience I've had in Philadelphia too. But I don't know what about the census takers out here. Hi, Joyce.
Hi.
And we have a question from Linda Dunn, who asked, who were the people living in Lower Merion prior to 1682?
People who were living in Lower Merion prior to 1862, and I do mention them as I come by. You know, they would have been some portion of the Lenape. I'm not aware of people having done their research yet, and so I'm hoping that somebody will.
Thank you.
Linda Dunn, is it you who's going to do it? That'd be great.
Excuse me, weren't the Swedes also here in 1682?
I'm not aware of many Swedes in this neighborhood. Swedes tended to be, let me back up a little bit. There may have been a few. What William Penn did was say that he wanted to have a variety of kinds of people. Diverse people is how he described it, D-I-V-E-R-S, no E. But he didn't expect his diverse people to all live in the same place. He put the Germans in Germantown. The Swedes were were along the Delaware River, south of South Street. Germans were in Germantown. Others were out Lancaster Avenue, and by 1720 or so, Lancaster is its own county. So my understanding of what Penn was up to is that he didn't assign land to different ethnicities in the same place. They were nearby, but they weren't in the same place. And I would encourage you to relook at Anthony Garvin's piece, Proprietary Philadelphia as an artifact, which was done in the 1960s. Really fascinating piece about how the geography was done. My understanding is that Penn did not put people of different ethnicities in the same neighborhood.
I just thought that some of them were living here before he acquired Pennsylvania.
You're correct. They were. The Swedes and the Finns came, what is it, after the Dutch? Before the Dutch pushed them out. And then came William Penn as late as 1682. But the Swedes and the Dutch were here much earlier, 1640s.
Thank you.
In Delaware, yeah.
And in this neighborhood and not along Delaware River?
Everywhere, yeah. They went up into just into Lower Merion, like along some of the roads.
That's a story with which I'm not familiar, but happy to be educated. If you send me some,
all right, I'll look.
Send me some notes, and my email is in the notes I'm sending you. Happy to have that piece of information. But I don't know if anybody has done work on the indigenous people who were displaced when Europeans arrived.
There is someone, but I can't remember his name. He's a history professor, but I think he may be in the South somewhere, even Texas, Mississippi. And I'll see if I can find him and send it to you.
Great.
And that's Janet, so I'll try to do that.
I don't know whether you can all see each other, but if you can, the person who is the U.S. colored troops expert is named Joyce Mosley, and she's right there looking at me, but she may or may not be looking at you. She's waving.
And we also have a question from Leslie Morris Smith. Leslie, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. What question was that?
I see a hand up from Leslie.
Oh, yeah, and then I typed it in the chat.
Oh, okay.
So, and then I said it out loud. Yeah,
Oh, okay, I see. The Swedes came first, then Dutch, then the English, and William Penn. Okay.
Right. So,
Okay.
but
You can send me a
Lower
citation,
Merion,
that'd be helpful too.
let me check if they came to Lower Merion. Good point. I will look into it.
Mhm.
I'm sorry, here's my video. Here's my video. Yeah, I'll look into it. Thanks.
Okay, that'd be great. Let's
So I
start a
see
conversation.
there's a question in the chat from Steve Elkington. Steve, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, or?
This goes to the Meeting House restorers. I've always loved the Marion Meeting House because it reminds me of some of the oldest meeting houses in England. I was wondering, in your architectural research, have you looked at the remaining meeting houses in Ireland, Wales, and England that might have served as antecedents or similar architectural buildings to the Marion Meeting House?
I have visited a couple of meeting houses in England and Wales. And one of the things I say in an article I wrote not too long ago is that if you are looking to visualize Quakers, you need to visit those meeting houses and see that they aren't much bigger than people's dorm rooms. They are, and but the message there, I think, is that the typical Quaker meeting before 1710 or even 1750 is a few members of a family and a few more of their extended family. And that's one of the reasons to have the network of monthly meetings, quarterly meetings, and yearly meetings, because you couldn't travel very far. You had to live with the people you had to worship with the people who could get to you on a given first day. And there weren't very many of them. People were scattered. That's one of the many things that I love about the historical archaeology, and thank you, Sutton, for doing it. Is if you look at the ground, look at the physical space people are occupying, you get something of a sense of how small a meeting had to be. I'm also, I didn't put this on the list, but I will. Take a look at Barry Levy's article about Quaker settlement in the Delaware Valley in the 1700s. People scattered over wide distances, small groups of people who could scatter over wide distances because they didn't have to show up at a particular temple. They didn't have to be part of a parish. They could set their family off on a huge piece of land and say to them, okay, go put Quakerism over there. It's a day's ride from me, but that's okay. Take your cousin and your brother with you and go start a new place. There's a really rich story, I think, that's scattered into a few scholars around the physical placement of Quakers. And the tiny meeting houses, to loop back to your question, the tiny meeting houses are a clue to how few Quakers there were in any given place. Quakers were soon outnumbered in Philadelphia. By 1720, they were outnumbered. Does that kind of get at your question? Yeah. If you email me, I'll send you some interesting reading on that, because Quakers get into trouble when they find themselves so far away. Quakers in North Carolina wandering around, and people get there and they say, you know, what are we doing here? What are we reading?
So I see that Dan has his hand raised, and I want to give him a chance. And then once Dan's done, I want to turn it over to Ross, just because I think you wanted to add one other thing.
Well, I'm sure Dan is going to address the same thing, Dan being our preservation architect. So go ahead, Dan.
I could address that question a little bit. If you're familiar with the form of the Marian meeting and the typical form of Quaker meeting houses in America, there's an immediate contrast visible. You know, we're familiar with the rectangular meeting houses in America with 2 sets of doors for the separation of the genders. And as an architect, we've studied many different ways, and clever ways that the partitions were made to separate the genders, with all kinds of folding and sliding shutters and so on inside. The Marian meeting being a T shape with a large room in the back and a smaller room in the front really was separated the genders by having the men in the larger room and the women in the T-shaped bottom of the T. And there are some folding up shutters which separate those two spaces. But to your question, the form of the Marian meeting, and even the structure in the attic, is more like a Welsh country church than it is a typical American or Georgian built meeting house that we're accustomed to here. One of the early projects we did was to rescue the unique wooden crux that are forming the structure of the roof. That was quite interesting. So I can't say that I've studied them myself back to Wales, but there are lots of studies on Welsh country churches and meeting houses which apply to Marian more than our typical American form does.
Yeah.
Can I jump in and say something about this? There's a I don't know if it's a dissertation or a thesis by David Mark Facenda called Marian Friends Meeting House, Documentation and Site Analysis 2002 at Penn, School of Architecture. And I believe that he points out that it's practically unique. In the UK, they don't even have them. And in fact, there were no meeting houses allowed in Britain until the Great Glorious Revolution of 1888, that only Anglicans could build churches and have gathering places. So there's not a whole lot of local tradition for anybody to draw on.
Glorious Revolution of
1688. 1688. Let's get in the right century. But in any case, so but the feeling is that it's a church plan that they brought over for whatever reason.
David Facenda was an employee of John Milner Architects when I was there, and we did an initial study of the meeting house for that structural reason I mentioned back around 2005-06.
And but it's a great book. I mean, there's a copy of it at the meeting house if anybody wants to read it.
Great. Thank you, Bob. And thank you, Dan. So I'll turn it over to Scott, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Okay, so I think we're coming up on 3:30. So I know that, I guess, Emma, do you want to, what would you want to do at this point? Shall we?
Okay, I was checking to see if I was unmuted. I think we should leave these people to go home and be all excited about, rather than wear them out and think, I've had enough.
Right, okay.
I just put into the chat though, and I hadn't pushed the button yet, that this meeting house thing is of interest to me as well, and that you might want to look at the recent thing done in 2002 by the Historic American Building Survey called Silent Witness, which is about these meeting houses in the US. And I would encourage you also to take a look at a study that I did with Anne Verplank in 2003 called Quaker Aesthetics, which takes a little look at meeting houses as well. And so I'm glad that there's lots of conversation. I share Laura Jackson's notion that there can't be too many historians in the world. Thank you very much, folks, for joining in the games.
Cannot thank you enough for your time and your expertise and your engagement with everybody here. It's been a pleasure, and I guess we'll have to figure out another time for the other 2/3 of your of your conversation.
I warned you about my mother and words.
Well, it's been wonderful. So thank you so much. And I want everybody to know as well that any material that Professor Lapsansky wants to share, if you just want to pass that on to me, and I can make sure that gets distributed to everybody that participated, I'm happy to do that. So I know there's, let's see there. Okay, so the silent witness book you had noted. Just one other thing is just to let people know, and I think, Bob had mentioned this before, as far as, visiting the meeting house and the grounds once the pandemic lifts and we're able to spend time with each other. I think safely outside and social distancing and doing everything that, not in groups, individually or in your own pod, could visit the burying grounds and the around there. But, just please be safe and follow all of the appropriate safety guidelines. We do have, we have our meeting for worship every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. We are on Zoom right now, and eventually, again, once everything starts to, the pandemic lifts, we'll be meeting in the meeting house as well. So I want to thank again, Professor Lapsansky. Thank you so much for your time, and I also want to thank everyone else for joining us. This has been great. Like I said at the beginning, the interest in this was overwhelming, so we are very pleased. So hopefully we'll plan some more of these, and we will bring everybody back to have another conversation. So please enjoy the rest of your day. And again, the website is maryandfriends.org. Thank you all.
Thank you, Scott. And you can join us for our Zoom meeting for worship every Sunday. It's on the website as well. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Em, I have a question for you before
Sure.
you get away. Do you know anything about the Quakers in North Carolina that moved to Indiana? Because my family's part of that, the Suttons, and they lived in the Dismal Swamp, and they left around
1812.
No, 1850, I think, just before the Civil
1950.
War. And 1850.
Oh, 1850. Okay.
Yeah, and they settled right near where Earlham is, Richmond, Indiana. And
They are a wonderful story. Between 1812 and 1820, whole meetings moved out of North Carolina so that they would not have to be involved in slavery.
right.
And then when the Civil War came, another set of people followed. I'm not the expert on exactly which meetings moved when, but I can point you to Tom Ham, who is. Thomas Ham, Hamm.
Okay, well, we've got a book on that. But what really struck me as interesting, and this, because we moved, I lived in Indiana and taught in Indianapolis for a generation or so. And one thing that occurred to me is, what happened to those people when they were liberated in Indiana? I mean, my family settled down outside of Richmond and Dublin and everything. And
the North Carolina thing is a really interesting story of which I have the edges. For example, between 1812 and about 1820, whole meetings moved from North Carolina into Indiana. Other whole meetings didn't move at all, but bought slaves and held them as their own. And there's a lot of discussion about whether or not they were treated well. They bought them in order to free them.
Right.
but kept them as property so they couldn't be stolen or resold
Right.
back into slavery. And there's a lot of controversy about how that all worked. So that's another piece of the story. When they got to Indiana, though, it appears that Indiana African Americans had an easier time in meetings in Indiana than other freed people had had in other places. I want to say that it's Linda Selleck who writes about this. Hold on one second. Let me go to the library and see what I can find. Tripod.bryn-mawr.edu. I think it's Linda Selleck who writes about this.
That makes a lot of sense to me because there was a community outside of Indianapolis where we lived that was a traditional African-American community where they'd settled. And even on the west side of Indianapolis, there was a very strong African-American community that goes way back that had the first American Black millionaire, supposedly, who was a woman who, I'm spacing on her name right now because I'm getting old and senile.
Welcome to my world.
Yeah, exactly. But, and sometimes the connections just aren't there to be made, but she has a major museum in a building there where she did hair products, and she made $1 million back around 1900.
Oh, that's Madam C.J. Walker.
Madam C.J. Walker, right. Madam C.J. Walker, and it's a major, spot in Indianapolis.
Yeah. And I don't know whether there were Quakers involved in that or not, but she eventually moves to New York and her daughter eats up her money. The book is called Free to Cross the Color Line, and it's by Linda Selleck. And I think that Selleck.
Okay.
I don't know that it covers what you're asking specifically, but it probably will point you there. Right. I would go read her footnotes.
Right, because a lot of these people, I think, were also into sending the Africans back to Africa, a movement that I think Abraham Lincoln was endorsing for a while.
And a lot of that got resistance from some African Americans who said, hey, I built this country, I'm not going anyplace.
And they've been here longer than a lot of the whites have been.
Right, exactly. And others, I was in a gathering of historians some years back, and someone was saying, how many people have grandparents who were born in this country? And, some people raise their hands. How many have great grandparents? How many have great great grandparents who were born in this country? And no one in the room except me raised a hand.
Right.
I've got grandparents that I can get to the 1780s. I can't get beyond that.
Wow.
But I think that Selleck's book will lead you there.
Okay.
And take a look also at a book I did a couple years ago called Back to Africa.
Okay.
Which addresses a Philadelphia Quaker who was going to try to help people get back to Africa because he thought they couldn't make a life in this country. And the number of African Americans who joined him in that, including the first woman newspaper publisher in North America, a woman who was in Canada publishing newspapers in the 1850s.
Wow.
An African American woman publishing newspapers in the 1850s. And she was part of the Black side of the Back to Africa movement. So there are a number of little rabbit holes for you to go down. And I'm happy to hand you others. I think everyone should spend all their time doing history.
Right. Well, for me, I don't do American history. I haven't done American history, but this is just something that's been gnawing at me.
Well, I don't care what
trying to track down the
any kind of history. But it's the gnawing that's the fun part.
But the family connection.
You're
sitting there,
right?
You're sitting there. Your family's both, patting itself on the back for having freed all these slaves, and then you think, what'd you do with them? Just dump them in the garbage? I mean,
yeah, exactly.
Exactly. Let them go off on their own, and it's sort of a toughie.
Well, Indiana and Ohio did a number of things. Try Tom Ham's, what's it called? I've lost it. I can see the book on my shelf, but I can't get to it. It's a group, United brotherhood and something or other that was in Indiana between 1842 and 1846. I'll think of it in a bit. If you send me an email, I will dig it out of my head and get it back to you.
Okay.
So Emma, I am going to have to step away, and I'm afraid if I hit end, it's going to shut everything down.
Yes, it will.
Okay.
But maybe it's time to let her go.
Yeah, you've been very generous with your time.
My email is in the page I'm going to send you.
Yes.
And you can email me with that question. Though I must admit you won't get quick answers until the semester's over.
Yeah, I bet.
And you are a historian just by asking questions about your family. That history is stories, right?
Right, I agree.
That's what it is. So join the club.
Okay.
Well, thank you again. All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.